I know folks are still joining, but we're going to go ahead and get started. And I wanted to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us for the IIP's monthly webinar. For those who don't know me, my name is Rachel Marshall. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution at John Jay College. And the IIP provides a national platform to bring together prosecutors, policy experts, and the communities they serve to promote data-driven strategies, cutting-edge scholarship, and innovative thinking. The IIP champions criminal justice reform policies that advance community-centered standards of safety, fairness, and dignity. And we're really delighted to be hosting today's event. And I just want to note, I know these are really challenging times for many, and it's nice to see so many familiar as well as new faces on this call to really talk about best practices and approaches to the work of prosecutors every day. So with that, I am delighted to welcome our panelists as we dive into this really important discussion on rethinking approaches to juvenile sex crimes. I want to go through our esteemed panelists' bios, but they're lengthy because they have so many amazing accomplishments. So we'll link in the chat the full bios. I will just very briefly introduce them. I will start with Dr. Apryl Alexander, who is the Metrolina Distinguished Scholar in Health and Public Policy and Associate Professor in the Department of Health Management and Policy at UNC Charlotte. She also is the Executive Director of the UNC Charlotte Violence Prevention Center. She received her doctorate in clinical psychology from the Florida Institute of Technology with concentrations in forensic psychology and child and family therapy. Dr. Alexander's research and clinical work focuses on violence and victimization, human sexuality, and trauma-informed and culturally informed practice. Welcome, Dr. Alexander. It's great to have you. Next, I'm excited to introduce Nicole Pittman, who is Executive Director of Just Beginnings Collaborative, also known as JBC, and is a leading expert on the harms of placing children on sex offender registries. Her Human Rights Watch report, raised on the registry, was based on over 500 interviews and exposed the toll on youth and spurred reforms nationwide. Formerly with Impact Justice, the Juvenile Justice Project of Louisiana, and as a public defender, Nicole has championed transformative approaches to child sexual abuse prevention. At JBC, she advocates for survivor-centered solutions rooted in healing, accountability, and systemic change. Welcome, Nicole. And last but certainly not least, I am thrilled to introduce District Attorney Dalia Racine, who's the Douglas County District Attorney in Georgia. Dalia was elected in 2020, and she's the first woman and first person of color to serve in this role in her community. She has lived in Douglas County for over 16 years with her husband, a Douglas County educator, and their 3 children. Dalia brings almost 20 years of prosecutorial experience to serve her community, and she has specialized in homicides, crimes against women and children, and human trafficking, and has led so much innovative work that we're excited to talk about. So welcome to all of our panelists. We are so excited to have you here. And we have a lot to cover, and I know some of our panelists may have a few PowerPoints. So I know there will be questions that come up. Feel free to put your questions in the chat throughout our conversation. We're going to reserve time at the end of our discussion to get to those. So you don't need to worry about us getting to them. So just put them in the chat, or the Q&A, excuse me, as we go along. So I'd like to get started with you, Dr. Alexander, if I may. And I'm hoping that we can kind of set some landscape of kind of the review of some of the literature as it relates to youth and sex crimes and sort of ground us in sort of what the research says.
Absolutely. And thank you again for having me in the space today. So again, just wanting to set the tone for the conversation that we're having today and talking about some of the collateral consequences of youth on the registry. When we're talking about these youth, I often refer to them as adolescents with illegal sexual behavior problems. These are adolescents, usually ages from 13 to 18, who've committed some illegal sexual behavior based off of whatever the state jurisdictional offense is. This is a small portion of youth that we're talking about, so approximately 4 to 5% of teenage males and 1% of teenage girls who've committed these offenses. But they do make up about 30% of all sexual crimes in the United States. So this is why we're having this conversation, because of the contact that we might have with these youth. Commonly, we have people ask about recidivism rates, particularly because when we're talking about prevention, one of our markers of prevention is really thinking about how do we get these kids to stop engaging in these behaviors. One of the things I like to remind people is when we get individuals in contact with our systems, whether it's the juvenile legal system or child welfare systems, once they've made that contact after engaging in illegal sexual behavior, they often receive treatment. This is, again, the goal of what we all want in this domain of really kind of thinking about how we get them access to treatment. Some of the research that's been coming out over the last couple decades is really revealing that adolescents who complete this treatment have lower recidivism rates than those who don't undergo treatment. But we had some follow-up meta-analysis and follow-up research, one from Michael Caldwell that looked at overall recidivism rates for youth who've come into contact with the system, some who've received treatment, some who haven't. And what they found in this meta-analysis is that the sexual recidivism rate or reoffending rate was about 5% over a 60-month period of time. Typically, when I go into community audiences and I ask about recidivism rates, people say 50, 70, 90%, once an offender, always an offender. But a lot of the recent research that we've had has revealed that this is simply not true. This is why I try to avoid these negative labels, such as juvenile sex offender, that these kids do not have these lifelong courses of recidivism. This label is misleading, unhelpful, harmful. We don't often see the deviant sexual behaviors that we might see in adults who sexually offend and commit egregious acts of illegal sexual behavior. So we have this big push to avoid some of these negative labels. We know that laws changed over since the 90s, of really kind of thinking about the Sex Offense Registration and Notification Act. People label all three of these as registration, but there are some distinctions on what each of these is. Registration is making sure that we have processes and procedures for tracking a person after they had committed a sexual offense. So making sure that their address, their place of employment is registered with law enforcement. More people lump community notification with registration, and that is more to alert the public of when a person with a sexual offense is in their neighborhood, near a school, other places where individuals, youth reside. And then there's also residency restrictions that prohibit where individuals who've been convicted or adjudicated of a sex offense can live. So not being near, again, a daycare, school, and other places. Again, a lot of people in the public don't realize that youth were placed on the registry. This wasn't the initial intent. Again, we had some very violent, high-profile cases of adults who had committed sex offenses, served their prison sentences, came out, reoffended, and even murdered people in the 90s, and we wanted to engage in action. And so when we initiated the SORNA laws, people didn't realize that youth were labeled under all of this as well. So the SORNA work, if we have these processes in place, do they help reduce recidivism? Do they help reduce overall sexual offending? So registration and notification, we have a lot of research. I gave you all the citations that I have. There's probably a ton more. Registration and notification laws have done little to reduce the overall sexual recidivism or prevent sexual abuse in our communities. So we're spending a lot of money on registration and notification laws without a significant decrease on the effects, particularly for youth. And so for us, really kind of thinking about what are the implications of youth being placed on the registry and community notification. Again, Nicole Pittman's going to go in more detail about this in a second, but giving the high level, there are more kids or youth who are convicted on failure to registry as a recidivism than recidivating for a new sexual offense. So we're spending a lot of time on those kids who, again, they might forget to re-register every year. Their families might forget to re-register. And that actually is a felony in most states. There's other nasty punitive measures that we're using on these kids, having to hang signs in their house that sex offender lives here. For those teenagers who are getting their license, thinking about the label of sex offender being on your license and what implication that might have, results in a lot of social, emotional, and psychological consequences. Children on the registry experience shame, stigma, isolation, loss of friendships, hopelessness, all factors that actually increase your risk for engaging in recidivism, that we need to be thinking about protective factors rather than factors that are elevating a person's potential risk. And then with regard to other mental health concerns, the risk for both suicide attempts and completed suicide is 4 times higher among kids who are placed on the registry versus those who've been adjudicated and not placed on the registry. And so really kind of thinking about the impact this has as we're trying to get these youth to reintegrate back into their communities. Again, their families have experienced harassment. Youth who are placed on the registry are more likely to be sexually abused themselves. which is really scary because a majority of these kids had already faced significant abuse and now they're susceptible to more abuse. We know kids on the registry are denied educational access and employment. And so when we're thinking about next steps, there have been calls to action to one in policies that would put youth on the registry, including thinking about community notification, residency restrictions, and thinking about, again, protecting our youth and reducing the likelihood of recidivism. My platform is we need to be talking about prevention. Sexual abuse can be prevented. And that's what I like to say in each and every one of these types of workshops. Let's think about how we're investing in more preventative tools in our communities that talk about healthy relationships, talk about boundaries, and there's some great evidence-based programs out there. When our kids do get the treatment, let's make sure that the treatment is developmentally appropriate, trauma informed. Again, my own research has showed that a majority of these youths have experienced physical or sexual abuse in their own backgrounds. So we really need to be thinking about how we're giving them access to the treatment that they need and deserve. Again, sex education programs that emphasize consent, healthy sexuality, and boundaries starting at an early age and continuing out throughout the lifespan. Focusing on how we target these adverse childhood events and get them access to early interventional tools like trauma-focused CBT and other evidence-based treatments. We need to focus more on protective factors that can keep our children healthy, happy, and safe. So making sure that is integrated in both our practice and policy work. And then engaging family and communities. Sexual violence is a community problem. We all need to be invested in this. And so thinking about how do we maximize success and help provide stability for our youth. So that's the introduction and context that I wanted to provide as we engage in this conversation today.
Thank you so much. And I think it's important that before we kind of dive into, you touched on so many important topics that we're going to walk through. As we start off discussing some of the themes that you raised, what makes kids who commit sex crimes different fundamentally from adults who commit those kinds of crimes? And when I ask that, I'm hoping you can touch a little bit on adolescent brain development and how that factors into what's the motivating factor for a lot of children who commit these kinds of offenses as opposed to adults who commit sex crimes.
Again, want to remind everybody that these kids are kids, first and foremost. Kids are capable of change. They're, like you alluded to, their brains aren't fully developed. We know that that frontal lobe isn't fully developed until your mid-20s. And a lot of people write that off. That is responsible for your planning, your decision-making, your thinking, empathy, all of the things that we need in order to thrive in our society. And then for me, what stood out in my work was the stories of these kids. Again, when people hear that I work with this population, they're like, oh my gosh, what is that like? And I'm like, they're the kids I see at Target on Sundays. And so we really need to kind of think about what happened to these kids for them to come in these circumstances. So one, thinking about abuse, again, a majority of these kids have experienced both physical and sexual abuse, as well as other adverse events like neighborhood violence and things like that. So I often ask, why weren't they exposed to intervention during the first case, the second case? And so we have a child welfare problem. The other thing, and why I talk so much about sex education, is we're seeing all these peculiar offenses, particularly with technology now. So how are we having conversations with young people about consent and boundaries? I've had cases where kids who had a picture of their girlfriend on their phone, teacher picks it up because they're showing it off or whatever. That's possession of child exploitation material in some states. That kid is now having this label that impacts them for the rest of their lives, and that's not who we want in the system. And when we're talking about intervention, my intervention is simply to educate that kid, educate them on why this is inappropriate for their age, what the ramifications are. And so I think when we hear this label of sexual offending, people automatically think the violent types of offenses, but it's everything in between. And for some of these youth, just thinking about the vulnerabilities, we're seeing increase in youth with disabilities in our criminal legal system and then in these programs who, again, might not have fundamental understanding of consent and boundaries. Kids with, again, behind on education. So really kind of thinking about who these kids are, and that gives us an understanding of why they are coming to us. Again, I'm not excusing their behavior. Accountability is always first, but really thinking about how we're framing the context of this problem of youth sexual abuse.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alexander. And DA Racine, I want to bring you in to talk about what your perspective is as a prosecutor who has specialized in sex crimes more broadly. But what are you seeing when you kind of see these kinds of sexual offenses committed by kids? Are they similar? Are they different? Like, what sort of themes are you seeing in sex cases presented to your office involving children as opposed to adults?
Yeah. Well, first off, I want to apologize to Apryl because I may incidentally use the terminology of juvenile sex offender just because it's like bred into our DNA as prosecutors. While recognizing the harm it caused, I promise I'm not trying to be intentional with that, but it is a legal term that we utilize quite often still within the system. And I also want to caveat my comments that, I am a continuous learner and have had the pleasure of hearing from both of my co-panelists on this topic where I appreciate the broadening of the horizons, and I think it's very important for us to have this conversation. Coming from Georgia, we are part of Metro Atlanta, and for those that Apryl was referring to, where sex ed is very difficult to get into our school system. As mentioned, my husband is in the education system, and it is a great frustration where we can't even talk about, body awareness and sexual health and healthy relationships and get into consent. We try to fashion and finagle some ways where we do that from outside parties, but we are one of those states where it is a felony for CSAM possession. When we talk about those images that are just being passed around by kids because they have been raised by social media, and it's like, oh, look at what I've got. And so we see kind of that adolescent behavior, which may not be attached with the predatory behavior, which is often harshly penalized, but we definitely try to divert all those cases through the education awareness piece through that. But in talking about what we see, we do see a lot of the CSAM cases coming through. But we see a lot of what we consider quote unquote consent crimes, because in Georgia, you can't consent if you're under 16, but where it's two similarly aged individuals engaged in sexual curiosity, sexual experimentation, and one parent may call, the other parent doesn't. And so those cases end up in our system in ways that we also try to divert those out of our system. And we do have Romeo Juliet statutes where those are oftentimes misdemeanors, but luckily oftentimes diverted because that's not something that necessarily needs to be criminalized. It's adolescent behavior and things along those lines. We see similar situations where there is a larger age gap, and mostly those are intra-familial cases. And so those can be a lot more complicated, especially when you have parents that are the same set of both the victim and defendants, or family members of both the victim and those that are charged, that there's the competing interests in what should happen. And then, to be honest, the larger the age gap, the more difficult it is sometimes to find what is the right resolution and solution to these. But we also understand that, these are situations, to Apryl's point, that we see the cyclical nature of abuse that shows itself up. And this is kind of something that's a multi-generational impact. And, the stories we hear come from a different lens, which is why I also appreciate hearing from Apryl and Nicole and their perspectives, because often what we hear is from the 6-year-old or 7-year-old that is now adding to our list of sexual assault abuse victims that is becoming now a statistic, like unfortunately so many of us are. And so it's how do we stop that cycle is really the priority. What is the best outcome in these situations and scenarios? And I think the biggest onus that we can take on is educating ourselves with the data-driven best practices solutions so we can figure that part out.
Absolutely. And we want to get into that in just a minute and give a lot of the line prosecutors who are on this call some real guidance on how to think about these cases. Before we sort of dive into that, I want to bring you in, Nicole, to ground us a little bit in some of the real stories. Dr. Alexander mentioned some examples of some of the young people that end up committing these kinds of offenses. And you have done so much work talking to and working with young people who've committed sex crimes. Can you tell us about the work that you've done and tell us a little bit, to build off of Dr. Alexander's points, like what are some of the life experiences that a lot of these young people have had that may have led them to commit these kinds of offenses?
Yes, thank you. Yes, very similar to what both have said. We have a child welfare problem as well. And so let me just take a step back, because when I talk a little bit later, I'll talk a little bit more about the impacts in some of the stories. But a couple of things I just want to highlight very briefly. One, you'll see that I interviewed and did work as a public defender and a policy expert on children that committed sex offenses. And that report featured 500 interviews of folks that went on the registry in juvenile court and meeting them at any time in the progression of their life when they reached out to have an interview, whether they were 19 and went on at 17 or 16, or whether they went on at 8 years old. And I met them when they were 28 or 30 or 35, meeting folks that went on. And one thing that I didn't do for the report, but did after, was putting together and the information about the question, have you been a victim before, and when was that? And what that turned out to be was 100% of that 500 sample were victims in the child welfare system, at least about a year before the offense that they committed. So they had an established case in the child welfare system before they committed the sex offense that put them on the registry, which was mind-blowing for me and mind-blowing for many of us. And so it comes down to the term trauma not transformed is transferred. And how do we start to get ahead? And how do we start to really work on what are the issues that are happening with young folks that are committing sex offenses? And the other component that I'll talk a little bit about later, so that will be one of the themes. The other one is that we know if you look at Daniel Sarad, who has written amazing things in New York at Common Justice, then some of the main things that lead to offending and violence are shame and isolation. So when we think about how we're treating the folks and children that are going on registries or young folks that are going on registries, the things that we're doing are actually drivers. And so we have to really take a step back. And I think I know that's what we're going to be talking about today. But I just wanted to emphasize too that they ran the gamut of the offenses from what you would think of the most heinous cases, which they're still children, they're still juveniles, or the young folks, which I'll talk a little bit about, that have pulled their pants down in a setting where there are other children and they're 10 years old. And we'll get a little bit deeper into that in the next few questions.
Thanks so much. One of the things that often comes up in prosecuting these kinds of cases are psychological evaluations and assessments. And Dr. Alexander, I wanted to ask you, how do those assessments factor into the cases that you see be prosecuted, and what complexities arise from interpreting those evaluations in cases involving young people?
Yeah, a lot of times we're tasked with having to do risk assessments on these youth, which risk assessments is a complicated topic in itself because, like I showed earlier, the base rate of sexual violence is low and the base rate of recidivism is fairly low. So a lot of these kids are, just given some of their criminogenic factors, pretty low risk. Again, if we think about history of mental health, if we think about a number of the kids that we saw in the treatment facility I worked in a number of years ago, this was their only one offense. So these weren't kids who had multiple offenses over a life course like we might see with adults who sexually offend. So a lot of them were coming in as low or low to moderate risk. So when we're getting these risk assessment tools and trying to predict, it's really difficult to kind of pick up on which kids are going to engage in this behavior because of the low base rate to begin with. So for us, it is looking at kind of a combination of risk and protective factors to see if this child, are there any kind of risk factors for engagement in the criminal legal system at all? Are there any risk factors for other mental health concerns? And then we can address those. What the risk assessments do help us with in looking at these factors is thinking about targets for treatment. And that's where we would often use it. For some of those kids who might be a little bit moderate or moderate high risk, thinking about things like low empathy, lack of regard for the victim. Again, usually rare with the kids that we were working with, but something that can elevate a person's risk. And so thinking about how do we develop treatment targets based off of that data that we're collecting, and then us working together with community partners to find treatment programs that can help aid with some of the risk factors that we're identifying. Again, one of our kind of mottos is treatment does work, and that there's access to evidence-based programs in a lot of communities that can provide this treatment. And we have a lot of like I always say the big three evidence-based treatments, the trauma-focused CBT that addresses one, the trauma history of these youth, and then some of the relapse prevention work. We've seen MST, which is multisystemic therapy, which incorporates family and community. Again, all of those great protective factors I identified earlier. And then for our younger kids, we often talk about parent-child interaction therapy. Again, I think Nicole and Rachel both alluded to 10-year-olds, which wasn't on kind of my description of these adolescents. So how do we engage with these kids early to address some of the behaviors that we see? So using our assessment tools to be able to find treatment targets, I think is what's important for us when we go into the courts.
Yeah, DA Racine, I wanted to bring you in as well on the question of psychological assessments. And how do you, as a prosecutor, approach these kinds of evaluations? How do you advise lawyers in your office to approach these kinds of risk assessments? And what are some of the challenges that emerge when you're interpreting those results?
Yeah, so we have the luxury of being like a mid to smaller size office. And so we have the ability to have that more intimate touch with, no pun intended, with having the ability to sit and roundtable those assessments and determine what is kind of the best solution and resolution. We are very proactive anytime that we have a case that's coming through our juvenile court system, even if they're charged in Georgia SB 440, where a juvenile could be charged as an adult, and especially for sex crimes, that is within that umbrella of offenses. But we have the opportunity, we're very early on, the courts are seeking and requesting for those psychosexual evals. The timing of when we get them can vary now, of course, but it is something that we are very intentional about obtaining before we come up with solutions and resolutions. But I do say that we lean in on them pretty heavily. But the counter to that is what Apryl was talking about, those big three is very limited in our community as to what resources we actually have based off of that psychosexual evaluation. There's so many other like factors as well that we've kind of touched on: familial support, what individuals want to do. Does this child now have a place to go, or is the family abandoning this child based off of these issues? And so that can also thwart efforts to get resources in place. But I also want to note, Nicole, I have noted, and I will give you credit for the trauma not transformed is transferred. I feel like that needs to be a t-shirt because honestly, I think that's what we see so much. And let's be honest, sometimes these disclosures that are coming from the kids, Nicole talked about the 100% check yes rate for the abuse. And sometimes kids are willing to admit that there is abuse that is happening, but they're not willing to say who. And so sometimes the reality is that there is the opportunity that we may be placing them right back in that system, right back in that house that is causing the abuse and the perpetration as well, and the cycle to continue to enhance. So I don't mean to say that as a doomsday, or what I mean to say is that while even with the knowledge, armed with the knowledge of what we can and should do in certain situations, we don't necessarily have the resources to fulfill those needs a lot of times.
Thank you for that important perspective. And I want to turn to something that Dr. Alexander raised in your opening remarks around the impact of harsh sentences and particularly around registration. I think, and you alluded to this, DA Racine, that these cases can cause tremendous harm to the victims who are often very, very young. And as a result, I think many prosecutors and others, members in the public, really want to see significant consequences. These are cases that cause great harm, and prosecutors are trying to really reduce the amount of harm that they see and address the most severe harm that they see. So I wanted to talk about what are the appropriate consequences for that harm, and what is the impact of harsh sentences that so many are inclined to give out in these kinds of cases, whether through incarceration or sex registration. And so to start us off as we dive into that discussion, Nicole, I wanted to ask you to sort of ground us in some of the stories and particularly about the effect of consequences on the impact of kids who commit sex crimes, and what you've seen about the impact of those harsh consequences on kids.
Yes, thank you. Let me just I'll just do a couple of slides, just a few. But thank you. And it's such powerful, actually. I just want to say I'm really in awe and of Apryl and Dalia, what you're saying. And so I'm really moved to really taking it in and listening. But one of the things that I mentioned is that the report raised on the registry, it's actually available in PDF on, if you go to Human Rights Watch or Google it, the irreparable harm of placing children on sex offender registries. It's a little bit of an older book, but a lot of it still stands. And again, it's based on interviewing 500 young folks, 500 people that went on the registry as juveniles, not as adults, as juveniles, and talking about the impacts. And so some of the impacts that we see are barriers to education. Many, of course, there's a big swath of policy and legislation coming through right now that's banning kids that have certain offenses from going back to school. And we think about that again when we go into things that cause violence, our inability to meet your needs, isolation, shame, and exposure to violence. And so when we're keeping kids out of school, what are we doing for the future? Housing instability, which Dalia just mentioned, and in terms of what family member or who can take this person, are they homeless? Can they live near a school? Can they live near a school which the parents might live near? Barriers to employment, which we know I am working with a large amount of folks right now that have gotten out after some 20 some years after years being in with a registrable offense. And as juveniles, they went in, but they're realizing that even though they were told things were going to be sealed or expunged, registration is available for people to see. Economic, even if it is taken off the table, people can still find out that you're on the registry. Economic issues, which are hand in hand with employment and education as well. Family harm, I'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide. Psychological harm. One thing that I don't talk a whole lot about in exposure to violence, the two together, is interviewing 500 people. Number one, I realized I thought I was going to be meeting with people in these space, so I set up in a library and realized that folks can't come to a library or come to public spaces. So I was largely going into people's homes. And so going into homes where people were on the registry, I will say, hands down, I've never felt as safe as I felt going into the homes of these folks. But I've also never felt such decimation of a generation, of a group of folks. Shells of themselves, just gutted in terms of psychologically, and everything that was coming towards them. They just were so beat down. And it was there was a lot of trauma I received from doing this, because I just felt like we were overdoing it with our young folks. These are people that went on 8, 9, 10 years old and meeting them in their 30s and 40s. So it was decimating. Exposure to violence and cycles of incarceration. So just in terms of when I talk about the intra-familial harm, one of the people I interviewed said a child on the registry is a family on the registry, and oftentimes a victim on the registry. And just like Dalia was just saying, many times intrafamilial, if the child is allowed to live in the home, many times the victim is also in the home. So when you think about putting the address of the child or the person that's on the registry, you're also putting the victim on there. When you think about all of the resources, there's so many times, this is an example of the child in the middle lives in Bemidji, Minnesota, and went on for sending a picture of his genitals to another student, a classmate. His brothers are also, they can't have friends over, ever. There's so much triaging that's going on with the young man who went on the registry that, interviewing them, they felt so alone and isolated themselves. The family was just really trying to protect the older brother. And so we're also harming families. Barriers to employment. I know Apryl mentioned that this is a license from somebody that was 14 when he went on, and he didn't have a driver's license at the time, but he had to get this license and ID because you have to have this emblazoned and show identification in Louisiana that you're on the registry. And when I went this young man, he was actually really excited because he was going to go out for football and try and interact and try on the football team. And the first thing you have to do is you get weighed, and then you have to show an ID. And this is what he had to show. So he left. He was decimated. The second thing that hit him was in Louisiana. This was right around Katrina. Not Katrina. This was right around Katrina, one of the bigger hurricanes. And I talked to him on the phone for hours because he actually couldn't go to the hurricane relief shelter because he's on the registry. So young children that are on the registry cannot go and be safe when there's a natural disaster. The cycles of incarceration. This is the last one that I'll just talk about. This is a young man who at 10 years old actually pulled his pants down at a party where there were kids 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. And one child that when she got picked up by her parents said, "I saw Bobby's penis." The case ensued and Bobby was adjudicated delinquent for that indecent exposure, which was a registrable offense when he got out. And when he got out, he was an older teen. He wasn't able to live with his own family. He was couch surfing, which is also failure to register, failure to have a proper address. He was actually convicted of failure to register and put in prison, adult prison, as an adult. And this happened 3 times because he could not get an address when he got out. And this was Bobby at age 31 in 2015. This is a journalist that took this photo, was really interested in this issue. With 3 felony convictions for failure to register, he was pretty much going to be in prison for the rest of his life because of an offense that he committed when he was 10 years old of pulling his pants down. So those are just a few of the things that I wanted to share with you all. The one thing I also wanted to just mention too is when talking to some of the interviews I also did was talking to prosecutors and public defenders. And I went to a county, Grand Rapids, Michigan, where there was sort of the highest number of youth going on the registry at that time. It was around 2010. And it was a long-term, really respected prosecutor of juvenile system. And I asked her about the folks that were on the registry, thousands and thousands of young children. And I said, sometimes you're not supposed to ask a question if you don't know, and she was being recorded. But I asked her, of all of these folks that are on the registry, all these young people, how many do you really think were very dangerous? And she said 2. And I said, oh, 2%. She said, no, 2. And this was thousands and thousands of kids. And at that moment, it hit her. And she said, for the amount of money and the amount of harm we did, we could have put private guards on these 2 kids, instead of putting all of these folks on the registry and really thinking of a different way. It was a really amazing moment that we had talking. That's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole. And those are some really powerful and terrifying stories. And just to kind of push back a little bit, I think a lot of folks on this call, I hope, recognize that putting an 8-year-old on a registry for something like pulling down his pants is deeply problematic. But I think there are cases that a lot of the prosecutors on this call probably view as tougher, where there is, an actual act of violence that really does cause great harm. And so I think that many of the prosecutors with us today probably don't favor sex registration for young people, especially, but do worry about how can we effectively monitor kids long term and prevent future crimes, especially when we don't have we've chosen, I guess, not to have the resources to put a guard, like you just mentioned, on the folks who we're most worried about. So I wanted to ask you, Dr. Alexander, sort of how do those harsh sentences impact not just sort of the tragedy and unfairness of these stories, but how do they impact the ability to rehabilitate versus recidivate?
Yeah, again, I'm always moved. Thank you, Nicole. I've seen you present a number of times, but again, the impact is always there when we hear these cases. For us, just kind of thinking about what is the purpose of the juvenile legal system. One of the papers I recently wrote focused on therapeutic jurisprudence, that, the intent behind the juvenile system is reform and understanding that these children do change, that these harsh sentences puts these children under an immense amount of surveillance. Just think of that child who has the license that says sex offender on it. When you show that to a person in a store, you are now on high alert. You are now susceptible of being harmed. So just all those consequences for them. And one of the things that I do point out in Michael Caldwell's study is, yes, you saw the low recidivism rate for sexual reoffending, but a bit higher for general reoffending. So again, even though they're receiving treatment for the sexually abusive behavior because treatment works there, just thinking about all the other things that we are setting them up for failure by these harsh sentences. If you can't find a job, if you don't have a place to live, we're putting a person at potential higher risk for dangerousness. And so for us, really kind of thinking about what is our goal in this process? Yes, again, it's accountability. Yes, thinking about the victims and their families of these offenses, particularly in these harsher cases that you're describing. So yes, that's first and foremost, but we do have to think about this child and what we want to see as an outcome. Again, no recidivism and hopefully a space of healing. We always talk about recidivism as the outcome and goal, but how do we get this person to live a happy, healthy life? I want to measure that in my research more often, but everybody's always focused on recidivism. Are they going to be a good adult? Are they going to be a good person? And for some of these kids that I've seen in my past, they do. They want to and they can be transformed.
Thank you. And Racine, I wanted to ask you as well, sort of, you work with so many victims, including of these kinds of crimes. What are you hearing that they most want in terms of consequences? And how have you seen, when there are tough consequences, how have you seen that affect the reporting of cases? And when I say tough consequences, I mean, significant incarceration and sex registration.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends. Lawyer answer. I do not envy any of the prosecutors on this line that have to make these tough decisions because I know being in that seat how awful it can be. And I think that also when we talk about the collateral consequences on the victim, like sometimes it is not the youthful offender that's removed from the home. Sometimes the decision is made to move the victim. And so that can upend their lives as well. And oftentimes victims can be left in a position where they regret disclosure in the first place. Because of how it uproots their lives without that stability and without kind of that support that may happen. I do think that when we talk about, to April's point of like, we're so focused on recidivism, I think there's also oftentimes the neglect because we're so focused on the, I won't say repairing the harm. I think we don't really look at that, but not only of rehabilitation of the youthful offender, but reconciliation with the victim. Like I said, these are intrafamilial incidents. And most times, in a lot of sex abuse cases, even with adult offenders where there's an intrafamilial relationship, they still love the offender, right? There's still the desire to have a relationship. It's just the desire for the abuse to stop. And so our system is not set up for that type of reconciliation. Oftentimes, I know there's lots of concepts, ideas, restorative justice, things along those lines. But we are not set up with that mind frame. We're not set up with that kind of mentality of how can our resolution facilitate this reconciliation. Oftentimes it's very black and white. We just need them absolutely away. We don't have a pathway to healing. What we also know is that more than likely, once these parameters are out of place, there will be opportunities for them to reconvene. There are going to be the family gatherings. There are going to be the social settings where they're going to run into each other, and we don't do a lot to repair that relationship once the abuse has stopped as well. I do think that, in making these decisions, we have heard as prosecutors, again, I don't envy them being in that position, that we hear some of the most horrific accounts of what has happened to a child. Children screaming out for help for their parents, calling their father, begging the person to stop, bleeding from, their orifices during these sex accounts. Like that is the narrative that we hear all the time. And so it's very easy to neglect the other side of that. But I think that the other piece is, if we could imagine hearing that narrative that is so atrocious, that is so traumatizing to hear oftentimes as well. But what if that was the same person that we now have before us for sentencing? What if that is now that same person that we established that rapport and bond with that now is before us, which is oftentimes the situation? To answer your immediate question, because I definitely took the long way around, when we talk about what victims want, we know that oftentimes when we have we have juvenile victims, they are not often heard. It is often the conversation is what the parents want, what the caregiver wants. And very few times is it what the child wants or needs. to have that healing and to have that restoration. We're really good about putting the resources in place to get the therapy, but we don't do a lot of that in fashioning a sentence. And I can also say it cuts both ways. I think anybody who's been doing this for a while will know we've had situations where parents are like, we want nothing to happen. And in fact, we just want to recall this whole process and act like it never happened. And we have the other extreme where they're like, especially if it involves a step parent and a half sibling, one parent will be like, that child needs to go away for the rest of their life and we never want to see them again. And so we have a really hard time with actually hearing the voice of the victim because it's often the adults in the situation that control the narrative. And in all fairness, these are kids we're talking about, and it's hard for them to even formulate what they need to heal from the abuse. But we don't spend a lot of time focusing on the healing component because we know how traumatizing this process is. But I will say that, we're always, from the prosecution perspective, we are always terrified of making that decision and ending up in that 2-person or really low rate where that person then goes on to continue their predatory behavior. And so sometimes we come from the lens of having to put away the predators, and those who deal with adult offenders, we are very familiar with that of, having to make, those are easier calls. I mean, let's be honest, it's easier calls when you have the 40, 50-year-old who's the serial rapist or has multiple victims in their portfolio of abuse and perpetration. But what becomes harder is figuring out who in our youthful or our children who are charged with these sex offenses, who of them has the future predator label. But I think there's no more important job to try to have that discernment in determining how we treat these cases moving forward, because I think we have a lot to do with that trajectory as well.
Yeah, that segues nicely into my next question for you, Dalia, Racine, around making decisions around whether to prosecute these cases in juvenile or adult court. We know that in cases involving young people, that can be one of the toughest decisions prosecutors ever make. Many prosecutors say that they will never prosecute kids in adult court. And so I'm wondering what are the criteria to determine whether a sex crime committed by a young person is going to be handled in juvenile adult court, and how does that trajectory sort of affect what's going to happen to that young person?
Yeah, we, again, like I said, because of our size, have the luxury that we get to roundtable our SB 440 cases, which is with our deputy chief ADA over our juvenile division, our trial leads. We all come together and we have the ability to kind of do a deep dive on each of the cases that comes before us. And I know this is a luxury, let me be clear. And so what we're able to do, because we have all of these individuals at the table, is we can look at the prior defects records, our CPS records here, to understand kind of what is more of the history of what the child has been through. We have obviously the access to any interactions with the juvenile court system. We have the ability to have educated conversations of resources available to the individual staying in the juvenile system versus going to the adult system. What is the best fit? What is their age? Where are we going to see them go? And so even with aging out of being in juvenile custody and having to be transferred to adult custody. And so these are really drill down conversations that we have. And they're not just one-time conversations. It's, here's the status. We're waiting on this psychosexual. In the meantime, this is what these parents are able to do. These are the resources the defense has suggested. So we are able to have really thorough conversations with a lot of input from a lot of different systems partners in our decision making. But I would say the vast majority of our decisions, we are keeping our kids within the juvenile court system. It is very rare that we are moving them to the adult system. And oftentimes when we are moving them to the adult system, it's with a lot of caveats, including limitations on the time that they're to register on the sex offender just for a term of sentence, whether it be 4 to 5 years, so it doesn't have this detrimental lifelong impact, while understanding before Apryl and Nicole come for me that there's obviously going to be some detriment to them being on the registry and to their families in the registry during that time. But again, it circles back to the limited amount of resources that are there, and to advocating for the victim at the same time. What does that victim want? What does that victim need at that time frame? And, every situation, it's hard to have policy because every situation is so different. And this is definitely an area of law where we don't come in with the sledgehammer, but the scalpel to determine just resolutions.
Yeah, I'm curious if Nicole or Dr. Alexander have thoughts on that, on the decision around or the impact of these cases being in juvenile versus adult court?
I think this is always a challenge. When I lived in Colorado, I worked with mostly attorneys on legislation around raise the age and having conversations about what cases get waived into adult court. Obviously, in some communities where there was incidents of school shootings and things like that, people are like, okay, obviously those. But it became tense when talking about these sexual offense cases. And again, being able to present the data, talking about the low recidivism rate. And so I think it's just a challenging discussion because obviously I don't think these youth should be waived into adult court just based off of the social science that we have. But recognizing, as Dalia taught so eloquently about, just the community pressures and the need for community conversations about all of this.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things that I totally do understand about the resources, but one of the things that, again, going back to Danielle Sarich, she's an amazing writer, common justice, who does a lot of restorative justice for violent crimes. She talks about a story of being a vegan or vegetarian in a desert and starving, and you come across a food truck that's serving beef tacos. And if you don't have much choice, that's what you're going to eat. And I think a lot of it, in when we talk about this is what victims want, we're not giving them all the time choices. We're not, we say this, it's either one thing or the other. And many times you want the harm to stop, and this is the only way that the harm is actually going to stop. I think there needs to be a multitude of choices for folks because victims are not a monolith. There's so many different ways of healing for folks or what people want. And it's not all at the same time. The other thing that I think that we're dealing with, and this might not be an answer, is a narrative. Dr. Mark Chafin, who passed away but was at University of Oklahoma, and an amazing a researcher and author, and when it came to sex crimes in children, he told me before I went out and did the interviews to really start to write down what you hear, like sayings, and start to see if there are patterns. One of the biggest patterns that I heard from parents that had a child that went on the registry, and especially if it was intrafamiliar, was, I wish my child had actually killed somebody rather than committed this sex offense. And so we have to think about if this is what we're, the waters that we're swimming in, where a parent of a child that commits a sex offense would rather him commit murder. It would be an easier lift. It would be better for everybody. It would be less shameful for them. That we have a problem. We have a narrative issue about what sex crimes are, and how do prosecutors possibly, how are we implicated in that as well? What are the things that we can talk about that maybe this isn't this isn't the end of all be all for this young person, that there is hope, there are statistics that show that this person is going to do well, that they can be better, that they won't do this harm. What are the help that we could give families dealing with this issue? I think there's some really important things that we need to think about.
Absolutely. So yeah, I want to follow that thread because I think we spent all of this conversation really talking about a lot of the approaches that don't work, that harsh approaches are not effective. They don't promote public safety. They're unfair. But obviously we want to do something, right? We want to make sure that there's no future victims. So what are some approaches that do work in treating kids who have committed these kinds of crimes? And Nicole, I can start with you.
Well, the thing I think we have to do, and this is outside of if they're line prosecutors, but I think a lot of places are now getting policy and legislative folks in their offices, in the prosecutor offices, defense offices. But if we start to think about one of the reasons why I shifted my work and kind of left the work on working, I testified in 38 states and in front of US Congress on this work over about 15 years. And in 2017, I was working in California and with a pretty good governor at the time on helping folks helping with ending sexual violence. And what I realized is we were trying to get rid of juvenile registration, which we did in California a couple years later, because it was a very a practice that a lot of people didn't believe was helping. There were about 3,000 kids in the state of California that were on the registry, and that money can be used elsewhere. And so we actually did an analysis and found out that we were spending $140 million in California to register these 3,000 kids, or just around 3,000 kids, where at the time in 2017, the state of California had about $46,000 for prevention and intervention. And so if you're thinking about that, then the money that's going to what we need is actually going towards registration. And there needs to be a shift. Because again, what we're talking about is a lot of times after treatment, after time away, then you go on a registry. And for young folks, it's just not an effective tool. It's not a necessary tool for most young folks. So I think that the thing is, when we start to think about, we need to get resources that we can have that they can go to where Dr. Alexander is doing the programs. What are the programs? What are the treatment programs that we can do? There's a lot of effective treatment programs for young folks that are out there that we're not, whether they're inpatient, outpatient, and we need to be utilizing them and having and securing money for them. And I'd love to, so just start with that one.
Yeah, let me follow up with you, Dr. Alexander. What have you seen be effective in treating young people and preventing future crimes? But also, what does that mean for prosecutors in terms of the resource issues? Like what approaches can prosecutors adopt given some of those constraints?
I think that's our challenge at this point in the conversation, right? So Dalia brought that up earlier. If you are in states or communities with low resources, then we do have a problem. And that is what's tying people's hands on kind of thinking about effective solutions. Again, we have a number of different treatments that do work for these youth, but do they have access? And so thinking about how do we support community providers and getting the training to offer some of these treatment programs, like Nicole alluded to earlier, we have the folks at University of Oklahoma who train clinicians in CBT for problematic sexual behavior, and they provide supervision to individuals across the nation. So how do we get treatment providers access to that training so we can have more individuals doing that work? I think they even have somebody based here in North Carolina who was doing some of the work virtually. So that opening up some options with telehealth services and being able to deliver this work. So I think that's the challenge right now. We know it works. We need to invest, as Nicole was saying a little bit ago, in prevention and intervention. So I think this is a space where I hope all of our attendees are thinking about spaces of advocacy. How do we make sure that communities invest in getting this work done if this is so important to all of us? So again, I kind of highlighted those big three earlier. We have treatment interventions that work. We need to help support people in getting federal dollars in order to continue some of that. A lot of treatment programs have been funded by the OJJDP. So again, where's our investment in some of these resources?
Yeah, Racine, what resources are currently available in your jurisdiction, and what is needed in terms of more resources?
A lot, but no, I mean, on now, looking at the participant list, we have folks from our juvenile programs department who are phenomenal. They are willing to ride with us on like thinking outside the box. They bring things to us, of just having that kind of institutional courageousness to do what needs to be done. But I think the first piece is the education piece, right? Because the narrative has so strongly been established of ensuring that we vilify any sex offender. It's the boogeyman. It's all these different things. And let's be clear, as a survivor of childhood sexual assault, as dealing with kids who have gone through horrific things, there is obviously a need for us to protect our victims. But I think when we take it from the lens that we've heard so amazingly from both Apryl and Nicole, from a community safety perspective, right, from a humanity perspective, that there's a lot of work that we should also have the interest in from the prosecution side to see what we can do to minimize future perpetration, because everybody just wants to not have their children be sexually assaulted. Like, I think that is a common denominator across all boards. And if we have very specific action steps in which we can cause the reduction of harm of our entire community, I think we all should have, at the very least, a conversation about that. And so the first part is being able to have the education, being able to talk about rethinking what to do with juvenile sex offender cases, right? Sorry, April, I just said it, and I just said I was going to say it, but I'm sorry. But in essence, we need to have this conversation ASAP with all of our systems partners, because honestly, the more diverse perspectives you have at the table, the better the solutions and the better the resources to find that. I think secondly, once we have those education, we can establish a community and systemic will to bring about kind of reimagining and rethinking through some of these solutions. And then number three, I think that's when the resources come. Like I said, our juvenile programs does really robust, amazing work. Our team, our juvenile court team for the DA's office does really, really great work of where we are trying to truly interrupt the school to prison pipeline. And oftentimes we think so much of all these other offenses and we other the sex offenses because it's really, really complicated. But that is something we need to have the conversation on. And so that is why I asked them to be on, to be like, let's start having this conversation. Like, let's start talking about what we need to do. And we'll probably be reaching out to the Apryls and Nicoles that are doing really this groundbreaking work to say, let's drill down on real specifics of taking baby steps, of just having the conversation, because too often we won't even do that.
Absolutely. And I think, another thing that's really important to talk about that I know DA Racine, everyone sort of mentioned a little bit, is the perspective of victims in these crimes. And Nicole, I wanted to turn to you because, I think you've done a lot of advocacy sometimes to handle these cases outside of court. How should prosecutors who may not be willing to do that approach these cases in a way that really serves the interests of victims as you've seen it through your advocacy work?
Yeah, yes. Well, one caveat that I want to say that for me and going on the road and interviewing folks is that we are coming in, we as a, meaning when your prosecutors and public defenders or defense attorneys are coming in at one instance of the harm. And we are deciding and calling, not deciding, one person is the victim and one person is the harm doer. But what it's showing in these cases especially is that we're coming in after somebody else has been harmed, the person that did the harm. And so that's the thing that I just want to be clear about, is that, and I know we can only deal with the instant crime, but when we talk about what do victims want, we also have to think about victims as the people that did the harm in many of our cases, especially of child cases, child sex cases, because many of them have been abused. And part of that is, again, healing for the young. So who is the victim? But one of the things, so I'll go in, so the instant crime, one of the things that I also heard that we did, Dr. Mark Chafin asking me to do another thing of assessment was, sitting in court and hearing a judge time after time with a victim in the room and saying to the person that did the harm, you have sentenced this person to a fate worse than death. There are, again, ways that we are actually, I have now dealt with and met, we do a lot of restorative justice work, where in our state, you can actually do what they call victim offender dialogues, where the victim can go and meet with the person that did harm and ask questions. Doesn't mean that they have to forgive them, but really have that power in a restorative circle. And time again, we are leaving with the victim feeling that they are in the exact same situation as the person that did harm, of the person that caused the sex offense. I have been isolated. I have been shamed. I have been marginalized. And so for right now, we're seeing that for victims, it is not all of a sudden an instant, I feel good. A lot of our victims are feeling just as, they might as well be on a list as well. And the other thing that we're hearing is, for a lot of folks, we do largely, most of our policy and legislation is related to strangers, when most of our sex cases are with people that we know. And so for a lot of people, it's about empowering. It's about understanding who we want to start changing those narratives. Instead of talking about who's down the street, we should really be talking conversations about who's at our dinner table. So a lot of the work that we're doing right now is victim-centered, victim-led, in communities. A lot of it is outside of systems, because people don't feel like there's a choice. I don't want my uncle, this is what we're hearing, I don't want my uncle to go to prison. I want him to stop hurting me. And how are we going to do that? And the only way that they think they can do that is by coming to a lot of our groups, our community groups, and doing a process, doing work, getting that person help, getting that person a place to live outside of the home, making sure that they're not around children or around other folks, and making sure that they're getting healing. There's a big effort for outside of systems because people don't feel like they have a choice right now. And they don't feel that the person that is doing the harm should go through possibly getting killed in prison, or harmed or on a registry. And so a lot of the victim center work we're doing is around restorative processes and justice, where both sides are getting help and assistance. And I can talk more about that later, but I just wanted to sort of introduce it.
Yeah, I want to turn to prevention, because we've talked a lot about what doesn't work. We've talked about solutions and the lack of resources to implement some of them. But increasingly, we're seeing prosecutors, especially those who are embracing reform, really try to address harms before they occur rather than just waiting until the harm has occurred. So, Dia, Racine, in your opinion, what kinds of trainings and support are most critically needed for prosecutors to help prevent these kinds of crimes before they begin? I know you've talked a lot about education, so perhaps that's the answer, but are there other strategies as well?
Yeah, I would like to think that for the most part, prosecutors are really trying to do what's right across the board. And I think that part of that is arming ourselves with the information. So I think hearing these studies, hearing this information, hearing about to Nicole's point of having victim-driven research showing the harm that can be caused, I think is going to be really important for setting the stage, and then turning and transitioning to Apryl's portion of like the really best practices, data tested answers to how to treat that. And I think armed with that information, I do think that you can see transformation in how these things are handled and how they're dealt with, and even talking about like reshaping what we're doing. So we have CPC, CBT already for our juvenile court and low level offenders, but it's like focused on child abuse cases and for low level offenses of the parents. And what if we use those same skills that we have at those same resources and transition them with this education to show the why? And so I think just reimagining those answers is big. But I also think, like, let's be real, it's an elected position, right? And all the tagline will be from anybody who is opposed to this or who is ignorant to the reality and the data that is driving is like, look at what that DA over there is doing now. And so I do think that there needs to be this kind of tangential need for community awareness and education, because to Nicole's point, the criminal justice system is not really a place of healing, right? We are a place of accountability and consequences. And so when we talk about, while those things can be a stepping stone to healing, it is not the cure-all for like the process to how do we heal. And so getting the community to talk about this, because what we know prolifically is that this is the most discussed, under addressed topic that we have. And so I think that having those conversations is so important for us to be able to just open this up to community forums to say, let's talk about the thing that we know is prolific in our households. We know that there's very few people in our community, in our societies, that are not impacted by this issue. And most of the times, the cyclical thing that we see is because if people do not, number one, trust our system to do the right thing, but number two, to Nicole's point, nobody wants to see their uncle that they really, really love outside of those things that they make them do, go to prison for the rest of their lives. That's just the reality. Now, sometimes do we have situations where there's just continuous perpetration and they are truly a predator that just needs to be put away? Absolutely. Those are the decisions that we need to make. But there is this lack of sophisticated conversation that I think we just need to change the political wheels for us to have, because it just needs to be had.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a real challenge, especially, you want to show that you're caring about public safety, and these approaches are consistent with that, as we've talked about, but it's a real challenge, I think, and something I'm a little bit stuck on still is sort of without the resources that a lot of you are talking about being needed. And while knowing the harms of, sex registration and harsh penalties for young people, what are prosecutors left with in those tough cases, where they want to do something different? They want those resources, they want treatment, but they don't have those tools. And what, I guess I'm curious for all of you, sort of how you reckon with that, especially in light of some of the really important points DA Racine raised in terms of political pressures and media pressures. If you just say, you know, I'm gonna just let, you know, not approach this in a serious way.
Well, one thing that I think that some pushback, I don't know how people in line prosecutors are doing, but I think there needs to be, if you are doing sex cases, there needs to be a social worker, there needs to be space, there needs to be resources brought in, that folks can then start to understand the fuller picture. I mean, I am still with Dalia when she talked about, you know, a lot of times the person that we're sending the child back to is the person that's harming them. So really just understanding the bigger picture, finding family, finding support, finding ways. The other thing I think is it's not sometimes some support, meaning it might not be all the time sex specific, but some sex crime specific for some is just really helpful for young folks. But what I wanted to also talk about is there are ways to chip away. And one of the things that I didn't mention is I had just presented to a public defender group about this and realized that the largest problem that a lot of things that it's happening is when a child gets adjudicated delinquent of a sex crime, of a sex offense many times, let's say it's in a state where there actually isn't registration, and then they move. Registration can attach and can attach for life. And so I think what's really important is also understanding the bigger picture. One of the things that people are doing, a lot of folks are doing now, is working with the defense attorneys or prosecutors and doing a stay, whether if it's a mandatory stay, a stay of the actual offense until the child can actually get some treatment or some help or some time or figuring out what to do so that that registration won't attach, which is a really dangerous thing. A lot of states, we also have civil commitment, where children can be civilly committed for life based on the juvenile adjudication. It's about 13 states, which is a really hard one to get out of, that I didn't mention, and that's basically under a civil act. So I think it's really important to start working as a team. There's a lot of groups there's a lot of groups of medical doctors, family practitioners that really want to help and come in and bring their testimony. I think Apryl mentioned, and not this time, but in another presentation, that I think we should really need to work together on this. This isn't a one size, this is for our whole community and really figuring out what the resources are that we can start to bring together. And then I think a really big thing is to push the folks above you to really start to try to free up some money because this is a big issue. I'm working now with a group of folks that went through the system as they committed murder. They committed all of these different offenses. A lot of men. They went in as juveniles, and they're coming out, and a lot of them are now talking about being survivors of child sexual abuse, and that sexual abuse not being attended to properly, or in some ways driving them into gangs, it's an issue that is affecting so many things that we're doing, and it's not just about sex. So I think that we really have to start working together, and with this type of case, more than any type of case. Sorry, that probably wasn't a really good answer, but it just kind of on my mind right now.
Thanks, Nicole. Before we turn to questions, I see we have a few in the chat. We're going to turn to them in a second. I just want to give each of our panelists an opportunity to sort of very quickly share some final thoughts, anything you wanted to leave the prosecutors on this call with. And I can start. I'll do it alphabetically. Dr. Alexander, I'll start with you.
I think Nicole just landed on it. If we're going to address this problem, we have to do so as a community. I think all the work and all of the accomplishments in this area have been due to having a wide variety of people at the table to have these discussions. So starting with prevention. So let's talk to teachers. Let's talk to coaches about all of this, because they are often individuals who are interacting with young people and witnessing it. We also have to name that this is often an issue affecting young boys. So issues related to toxic masculinity, issues related to sexual abuse and exposure to pornography. So really kind of thinking about how we intervene early. And then scaling up, having these community conversations, talking with our attorneys, talking with the social scientists in order to kind of brainstorm ways that we can intervene. They're experts in your community. We just got to find them and connect with them so we can be innovative in our approach. My final message is just really making sure that beyond the courtroom, how are we all involved in transforming our systems?
Fantastic. Nicole.
Yes, I would say I think it's really to start to step away from what we think is the monolith and what we think are, I know this is really hard for especially for law and prosecutors, to step away and really to ask when there's options, what do you really want to happen? And that might not be absolutely possible, but at least to start to understand what survivors want. I think there's this, I mean, as a person that was doing this work and as a defense attorney, I never actually checked in with myself, who was a survivor of child sexual abuse. And I just thought there was a narrative. And now that the work that I do, which is more restorative and transformative, realizing that survivors, again, we're not a monolith. And many times our healing is tied to somebody else's healing, especially the person that did the harm. And so by putting people away and making their lives impossible, it's actually not doing a service to the victim or the survivor.
Thank you, Nicole. Racine, you get the last word.
I had to do in my head the alphabetic format, and I was like, dang, I gotta go last. So yeah, what they said. Also, I think it's really about having the institutional courage to truly create community safety, which is our call, on the prosecution side. We represent the state. We often remind our victims, like, we will hear what you have to say, but ultimately we represent the state. And if we are talking about the state, which in essence is our community, it's having that institutional courage that my dear friend Kim Fox reminds us to always have in all these spaces all the time, that we are sure that we do that, right? And so institutional courage does not mean that it's going to be easy. It does not mean that it is prescribed to one like push button solution. It means that we're going to have to sit at the table and we're going to have difficult conversations. When we talk about the impact of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, there is no doubt about their impact on the well-being of individuals in our community and their contributions to health, negative health outcomes, negative socioeconomic outcomes, to their involvement in our criminal justice system, whether it be victimization, perpetration, and or both, which we know is very common. And so what I think I challenge everybody to do is that when we have this information, we then have to have the conversation with our own offices, with our community partners, about what does justice look like. Because if we are invested in snapshot justice, then we are also catapulting the harm. And so when we talk about having these conversations, it is not easy. It is the deeper dive. We are swamped with things that we are asked to do. We are asked to cure all of society's failures, which is how they land at our doorstep when society's systems fail. We are the resulting system that has to deal with them. And it's the conversation we've heard from Apryl and Nicole of, we have education systems that are not being allowed to have these conversations on preventative work. We're having a system that kind of deters people from disclosure because of what they see, what the consequences are. We're having all of these different things that are occurring, which are contributing to the harm. And if we are truly seeking justice, then what can we do to contribute to the healing? And so that's the challenge that I think we all need to take upon us.
So well said. Thank you so much. We have two questions in the chat. One is, are there any states with less punitive sex offender registries, for example, with reasonable expiration dates? I know, Nicole, you talked about California stopping it for young people who commit sex crimes. Do you know about other states?
I really appreciate that question. And I mean, there are states where registration is not even on the table. There's about 12, 13 states for juveniles. And those have existed we're trying to hold those states, especially with the federal SORNA legislation, and trying to move it the other way. But the problem is, what happens is a lot of times those cases then get moved over to adult court, and we're kind of kicking the can down the road a little bit. So one of the things that I want to say is there's not really such thing as a lesser harsh registration law. Even if it's private, I was able to find 500 people, and had to kind of cap it as well. It stays with you forever. And again, especially if you have a failure to register. So many people have failure to register convictions as adults that implicate and show that they were juveniles. And the other thing that really happens for a lot of young folks is they have to move out of state to go live with another relative. So you might be in a state where you are minimal kind of things, but then you go to Florida to go live with your grandmother because there are no children there, and you are on the registry for life, and can't live anywhere in certain spaces.
And our last question is, what other potential options could be provided to victims? And this person brought up Nicole's example of a beef taco food truck. Anyone can answer.
I would say like just being creative. You know, a lot of times I think in those roundtable discussions, so talking about, you know, limiting the amount of registry time. If you feel like you have to have somebody on registry, that we as the prosecutors have control over setting those parameters, especially when we're dealing with our SB 440 cases where we are compiling the agreement for the case to be sent to the juvenile level. And there's a lot of autonomy, which we also have a lot of kind of solution and solution-driven conversations with the defense bar. Like, what do you have? Tell us what you have that we could put in this agreement so that the judge will accept this and so we can move forward. So I would say don't be siloed in your approach. If you don't have the innate resources, you know, what the best practices that Apryl talked to us about, be willing to kind of have the creative solution-driven conversations from systems partners of kind of reallocating and having that information that we can utilize to create best solutions in the climate that we're given with the limited resources that we have. Yeah, I would say that's one approach that you can try to look at if you don't have more formalized treatment options. I know there are a lot of great folks who have been doing creative work out there. And one thing that I have found to be true is that they are very open and willing to have conversations with you if you want to explore what those different options look like too. So don't be afraid to reach out.
Fantastic. Well, we will leave it there. I want to thank our incredible panelists today for this really challenging and hard discussion, talking about some really tough issues. I want to thank everyone who's been watching and engaging. As Dalia said, or Racine said, starting the conversation is a huge part of this. So we appreciate you being engaged in this issue. And the IIP is going to have additional panels specifically focused on juvenile justice issues. So I know we have a lot of juvenile attorneys on this call, so please stay tuned and make sure you're subscribed to our listserv at prosecution.org to make sure you don't miss any future events. And thank you all again for joining us today, and we will see you next month for our next webinar. We appreciate you all. Take care.